In our last episode, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum, 10 demands, 48 hours, no negotiations. It was a document designed to be rejected, and yet Serbia, against all odds, tried everything not to. They accepted nearly every demand. And the one they couldn't, the presence of foreign investigators inside their borders, they offered a compromise that many, including Germany, believed was fair. Serbia made clear its desire to avoid war, but it wasn't enough, not for Austria. The reply was declared insufficient. Diplomats were recalled. Mobilization began. Franz believed he had covered himself, that he had preserved the appearance of diplomacy, that he could strike Serbia without consequence, that the world would understand and stand aside. But in the East, a much older fear was stirring. Because the moment Austria prepared for war, the bruised and battered Russian bear began to rise. This is road to destruction, the world wars. For decades, Franz had lived with the dread of a Balkan crisis that would draw in Russia. He feared a war the empire could not win, one that would stretch across its borders and expose Austria's fragility. Serbia was a threat, yes, but Russia was the abyss. That fear had nearly come to life in 1908 when Austria annexed Bosnia. Russia protested but backed down. At the time, it was still reeling from a humiliating defeat by Japan and a near revolution at home. Its army was disorganized, its pride wounded, its leadership cautious. But in the years that followed, that humiliation festered. Russia poured money into military reform, expanded its rail network, strengthened its ties with France, and made one thing clear to both allies and enemies. The next time Austria challenged the Slavs, Russia would not stay silent. So when Austria moved against Serbia in July 1914, the Tsar and his ministers faced a familiar question, but with a very different answer. They could not afford to back down again. Inside the Russian court, opinions were divided. Some ministers, like Foreign Minister Sazonov, believed that war was not only possible but likely, and that it would be better to confront Austria now with honor than retreat again and lose credibility in the Balkans with its allies and across Europe. Others urged caution, knowing how fragile the Russian state still was, and some quietly simply wanted a fight. Tsar Nicholas II was deeply torn. He did not want war. He feared it would tear Russia apart, as it nearly had a decade earlier. But he also feared what it would mean if Russia allowed Serbia to be destroyed. That would be a humiliation not just for Serbia, but for Russia's identity, as the guardian of the Slavs and as a great power. The pressure wasn't just emotional. Russian generals warned that a failure to act would shake alliances, especially with France. The entire balance of power in Europe, they argued, was on the line. And so, reluctantly, Nicholas gave the order. On July 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia, and on July 29th, Russia began partial mobilization, not just along its border with Austria, but toward Germany as well. For Franz this was the nightmare realized. A limited war was already becoming a continental one. Austria had assumed Russia would hesitate, that its army wasn't ready, that internal divisions would delay any serious response. But they were wrong, and catastrophically so. Worse still, Austria-Hungary itself was unprepared. The empire had spent weeks crafting a diplomatic trap, but had made almost no preparations for the consequences. Its military focus was entirely on Serbia. No troops had been moved east. No plans had been made for a two-front war. And now, with the very crisis it had long feared unfolding, Austria stood exposed. The assumption that this war would be short, limited and winnable was delusional from the start, and the same pressures that had driven Austria to act now compelled Russia to respond. At first, Russia's mobilization was framed as limited, a warning, not a declaration, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was a signal that Serbia would not be allowed to fall without resistance, that Slavic blood would be answered with Slavic steel, and that Austria's actions would have consequences far beyond the Balkans. In Berlin, German leaders had hoped that their blank check would buy a quick and isolated war, if only Austria acted quickly while Europe's sympathies were still on its side. But now Russia's move was seen as provocation. Partial mobilization was treated not as a warning, but as a first step toward a much larger war. And if war was coming, Germany would strike first. What Russia intended as deterrence, Germany interpreted as escalation. And the fuse burned lower. Austria had believed it could punish Serbia without waking the powers around it, and perhaps, if it had moved faster, it could have. But in turning a regional tragedy into a political opportunity, Austria had triggered the very disaster it had long claimed to fear. Its government, confident and divided in equal measure, had opened the door to a broader conflict, one it neither desired nor understood. Franz Joseph, now a ruler in name more than force, watched as his empire edged toward a war that would define and destroy the world he had spent a lifetime trying to preserve. Franz Joseph had acted. Russia had responded. And now history was beginning to slip beyond anyone's control. Franz Joseph had outlived revolutions, assassinations, and a century of European upheaval. He had buried his wife, his son, 2 brothers, and now, perhaps, the last viable heir to an empire that had lasted over 600 years. And yet, in the twilight of his reign, he still clung to the old certainties. That alliances would hold, that Serbia could be punished, that Russia might hesitate. But the world had changed. As Austria moved toward war, Franz Joseph watched not as a strategist, but as a figurehead, weary, isolated, and surrounded by men who promised strength but delivered chaos. The empire that bore his name was slipping from his grasp. Its armies were unready, its borders were exposed, and the war he had tried to keep distant was now drawing closer with every hour. In our next and final episode, The Dominoes Fall, how Austria's gamble triggered World War I. Austria had wanted revenge, swift, limited, and final, while being sluggish, delusional, and inept. What it triggered was a chain reaction of mobilizations and declarations that would pull every great power into the abyss. The war Franz Joseph had hoped to control would become the war that consumed him. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars.